What's going on, everyone? There was a little delay for starting. I hope the internet's okay. I guess we'll find out when we watch this back. This would not be a good time for the internet to fail us because this might be our most difficult reading of the year. So I will probably take it slowly. This might be kind of long. It's going into a lot of psychology. We are going to have to talk about fact versus opinion. I want to point out a couple times where the author is presenting a bunch of facts, but then they sneak in their opinion. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be cognizant of that. That's a word that we're going to come in contact with in this article, but it is very difficult reading. I've read it twice just to make sure I don't mess up too much. And there are some names here I'll probably mess up. I don't worry too much about the names, but it's very dense reading. Yeah. So let me get it up on the screen. We read up until paragraph 4, and we stopped here, and it starts out really tough here, I think. So John Stuart Mill, okay, there's a little, call that a little footnote. I don't think it's that important, but you can always go down to the bottom of the page. I mean, this one's not that important, I don't think, but you can see he's just a British philosopher, right? Sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not. Ooh, since we're down here, cognitive, just related to the brain, related to thinking. All right, John Stuart Mill wrote in 1859 that the only justifiable reason for interfering in someone's freedom of action was to prevent harm to others. Okay, I think that's pretty important. So this author here is presenting the opinion of somebody else. John Stuart Mills, the only reason government should interfere in any way is if that person is going to harm somebody else. That's what he says. It's his opinion. It's his opinion, not a fact. It's what he thinks. According to Mill's harm principle, we should almost never stop people from behavior that affects only themselves, because people know best what they themselves want. Okay, going back to the soda thing. Like, yeah, it's harmful. Best thing would be, look at this, best thing would be to drink water. After I've had a can of Celsius this morning and a can of Monster, but I am drinking water. But basically, I do know that when I wake up in the morning, I should probably have water if I want to be completely healthy. But I do know that can of Monster will wake me up. So, but that's my choice. I'm not harming anybody else. Maybe I'm harming myself a little bit. But according to Mill's principle, that as long as it's not harming anybody else, let them do it. Let them do it. All right, and they're going to talk about a couple times when maybe you shouldn't, just out of ignorance or whatever. Right here, 6. That almost, though, is important. It's fair to stop us, Mills argued, when we're acting out of ignorance and doing something we'll pretty definitely regret. You can stop someone from crossing a bridge that is broken, he said, because you can be sure no one wants to plummet into the river. Mills just didn't think this would happen very often. So let's just take this one example here. I mean, you don't want to tell people where to go, where they shouldn't go, but if there's a bridge that's clearly dangerous and it's waiting to be fixed, well, then maybe you put up a barrier and say, you can't go here. Citizens, you're not allowed because it's just too dangerous. Okay? So there's one. Hopefully that's not too bad. Don't tell people what to do if it's only going to harm themselves, or if it's going to if it's going to harm somebody else, tell them what to do. And if they're going to hurt themselves out of ignorance, just because they didn't know. Mills was wrong about that, though. A lot of times we have a good idea of where we want to go, but a really terrible idea of how to get there. It's well established by now that we often don't think very clearly when it comes to choosing the best means to attain our ends. We make errors. This has been the object of an enormous amount of study over the past few decades. And what has been discovered is that we are all prone to identifiable and predictable miscalculations, right? So some very big words there. Basically, in English, it just means sometimes we make mistakes. We're all prone to that. We tend to make mistakes. We're going to talk about a couple mistakes that we might all make. Research by psychologists and behavioral economists, including the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and his research partner Amos Tversky, identified a number of areas in which we fairly dependably fail. They call such a tendency a cognitive bias. A bias. Anybody want to take a stab at bias? Okay. If nobody said it, I will do my best to explain it. So whenever you have a bias, it's almost like a prejudice, and it actually is. So before you know the whole situation, you might think a certain way. So hopefully there are no teachers like this, but sometimes with gender, there will just be a bias. Like, how about this? Let's do a shopkeeper, okay? So somebody who owns a shop, and maybe they've had trouble in the past with teenagers stealing. So they might automatically have a bias. Before anybody comes into the store, they just might think automatically, okay, teenagers are more likely to steal from me. So when an older person comes in, whatever, there's no bias there. But when a younger person comes in, there's the bias to automatically assume that that person is stealing. How about that? So bias, if you know prejudice and bias, I think they're interchangeable. Yeah, it's like before you even know the whole situation, you have a certain way of thinking about it. All right. I wanted to do this all in one go, but there's a lot of explaining that has to be done. So maybe we'll break this up into a couple different parts. I don't want to rush through this because this is very dense reading. All right, cognitive bias. And there are many of them. A lot of ways in which our own minds trip us up. So our brain is to blame right here. For example, we suffer from an optimism bias. And I know I'm guilty of this sometimes, maybe less so than a lot of people, because I know other people that I surround, that I'm have in my life are more prone to this, but if I can highlight that. Okay, the optimism bias. What is it? Well, it's in the blue. That is, we tend to think that however likely a bad thing is to happen to most people in our situation, it's less likely to happen to us. Not for any particular reason, but because we are irrationally optimistic. All right, so let's take that, for example, optimism bias. We tend to think it's not going to happen to us. Okay. So I have had people in my life before who are smokers, right? And there's all that research out there, tobacco smokers, all that research out there. Hey, tobacco's bad. Too much tobacco could develop cancer. And for whatever reason, they're like, I don't know if they said it out loud, but they're like, it's not going to happen to me. All the research is out there, but so that optimism bias. So same could be said. I think teenagers have this. There's something about the teenage brain. Studies have been done where you're less likely to feel anything bad can happen to you. And I know I've been there in like cars. I mean, I think I've told this story. I'll be real quick. But one time I was in a car with my friend. I was in the back seat. I think there were too many of us in the back seat too. It might have been like 4 of us because I remember kind of not exactly sitting on the seat. But anyways, he was going on this like back row, like really, really fast. And at that point, I was like, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. But this guy, I mean, a lot of teenagers are like, nothing bad is going to happen to me. And, maybe you're right, maybe you're not. But that optimism bias is like, it's not going to happen to me. Some of that will disappear as the brain develops. I think we talked about that in the last unit, is that, the brain doesn't fully develop until the mid 20s. I'm in my late 40s. I still think my brain is, physically, I guess it's fully developed, but I do keep changing my mind on things. right, so we talked about that. Now, the last thing right here of this paragraph 9. This is going slowly. I know this is pretty deep stuff here. Because of our present bias, when we need to take a small, easy step to bring about some future good, we fail to do it. Not because we've decided it's a bad idea, but because we procrastinate. So they've introduced something else, the present bias. This is really deep stuff here. Because of our procrastinating. And this is one thing that I've gotten better at over the years. But I know as a teenager, my present bias was really my downfall sometimes. So how about this? Last night, my daughter, her charger, school issued charger, she goes to EL, hasn't really been working. So she's been borrowing my charger this week. And last night, kind of late at night, right before I was going to bed, she was like, "Hey, Dad, can I borrow your charger?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. I just need it back before the morning." Right. And so she took my charger and she had it for like an hour. So I'm sure her charger was, her computer was fully charged. But when I texted her, I'm like, "Hey," she was up in her room, like, "Hey, I'm going to bed. Love you." And she was like, "Hey, do you want your charger now? Or do you just want to get it in the morning?" Something kicked in because I did forget my charger earlier this year. I was like, you know what? My present bias. I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to procrastinate. I was like, no, I need to get that now. I want to take care of it the night before. That's huge. I think that comes with developing your brain. But a lot of time, I know, like, I'll do it later. That's like the thing that we always say when our present bias gets in our way. I'll do it later. That procrastinating. Okay, so we've talked about two really huge things that you might encounter in college if you ever take any kind of a psychology class. This is some deep stuff. So we're already at 12 minutes. Give us like one more paragraph. There's no way we're going to finish this. It's like 20. I think this is pretty deep. It's like 20 paragraphs. So we'll have to finish this a little bit later. Okay. Back to this. We just one more paragraph, try to get through this, okay? Paragraph 10. Jeez. All right. Another thing that we have to talk about here is the status quo. We also suffer from a status quo bias. Remember, comma, when you have those commas right there, that's when that. So if you're ever taking a test like the NWA and they introduce something that might be new, sometimes they will put these little things in these commas. And that's actually where they're going to tell you what this thing is. The status quo bias, which makes us value what we've already got over the alternatives. All right, status quo. Anybody, can you explain what the status quo is? All right, if nobody has said it, it's hard to explain. Status quo is basically what's happening now. Like if nothing changes, that's the status quo. So it's the thing that makes it so hard to explain is that nothing is changing. How can I use this as an example? Let's do it with a school rule. Maybe at the beginning of the day, and maybe this is a bad example, but maybe at the beginning of the day, there's just too much congestion in one door, right? Remember, they don't want us using multiple doors to get in the building, but maybe it's just like too packed, okay? So principal, vice principal are thinking, should we change something and maybe open up all of the doors? And then maybe one of them will say, no, let's just keep it status quo. We'll deal with the congestion, but I think that might cause more problems. So we'll stick with the status quo. It just means what's actually happening now. Okay. The status quo. All right. Almost done here. I promise. Just because we've already got it, which might, of course, make us react badly to new laws, even when they are really an improvement over what we got. And there are more. All right. So the status quo bias would be not wanting things to change, just happy the way they are. If you fear change, then you probably have the status quo bias. And I think we all have that to some degree, right? We don't like change. All right, 15 minutes. It's a deep one. I'm going to come around. You are able to do a few questions on the Google form. Take a look at those. By the end of the day, I will have the SA Zen Power School. So please either email them to me if you haven't yet. And maybe tomorrow you'll see the missing assignment. It's a big one. It's like 100 summative points because, we already did a essay earlier in the year and this one was the second one. So, I think it should be definitely a summative. Hopefully your brain's not too overwhelmed